Hello and welcome back to History for Atheists. Perhaps you've heard this story. Once upon a time, the Assyrians and Babylonians worshipped a beloved goddess called Ishtar. She was the goddess of fertility and sex, and her symbols were the egg and the rabbit, and her main festival was celebrated at the spring equinox, which was a feast of fertility, rebirth and sex, celebrated with orgies and feasting. But when the Roman Emperor Constantine decided to Christianize the Roman Empire, he took the spring festival of Ishtar and made it the Christian feast of Easter, taking its name from the goddess's name. This is why Easter is celebrated in spring, and why Easter is associated with bunnies and eggs, the symbols of fertility. So Easter is pagan in origin. Or perhaps you've heard a similar version, though this time it's the Germanic goddess Eostre or Ostara, who is the goddess whose festival gets stolen, and where again a fertility goddess gives her name and her feast to a Christianized event, along with her bunny and egg symbols. These stories appear every year around this time in pop history articles and get repeated uncritically by many atheists who accept the old-fashioned idea that pretty much all major Christian feasts and festivals are just pagan ones stolen and reworked slightly. So this meme about Ishtar gets shared widely on Twitter and Facebook and other online venues. Or this other one about Eostre is even more popular in atheist circles. So it and others also get wheeled out annually. Like a lot of this kind of low-level pop history factoid, these examples are neat, cute, simple, and easy to understand. And these ones, like the similar ones about the pagan origins of Christmas and Halloween, are propagated as unalloyed fact by atheists who like to think they are rationalists who carefully check their facts. Unfortunately, these claims of pagan origins are quite simply dead wrong. Easter is, of course, the Christian feast that commemorates the death of Jesus on Good Friday and then celebrates the claim that he rose from the dead on Easter Sunday. So what it celebrates is pretty clearly completely Christian. But why does it fall when it does? And does this really have anything to do with earlier pagan festivals that were appropriated? The death and resurrection of Jesus are central claims of Christianity, and so it seems they were being commemorated from very early on. Our earliest evidence of Easter celebrations dates to the mid-2nd century in the form of an Easter sermon by Melito of Sardis, and it's likely this reflects much earlier practices. But the issue of when Easter should be celebrated was a complex one in the earlier centuries of Christianity. The three synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew and Luke, depict Jesus dying on a Friday after eating the Passover meal the night before, and then rising on the following Sunday. The Gospel of John complicates things by depicting Jesus dying on Passover preparation day, not Passover itself. That aside, all the Gospels depict Jesus and his followers going to Jerusalem for Passover, and his death and resurrection happening around that festival. So the earliest Christian celebrations of Easter stuck to the Jewish calendar and had it coincide with Passover. But this posed a problem. The Gospels also emphasised that Jesus rose on a Sunday, and Christians have been worshipping on Sunday since at least the late 1st century as a result. So many Christians wanted to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on a Sunday as well. The problem was that the Jewish calendar is lunisolar, which means Passover falls on different days each year. This meant it only fell on a Sunday once every few years. As a result, some churches celebrated Easter on Passover in line with the Jewish calendar, and others celebrated it on a Sunday close to Passover, though with no consistency on exactly which one. And here's where the Roman Emperor Constantine comes in. He's the villain in a lot of pseudo-historical claims about the history of Christianity, as I've detailed in my previous video, Constantine and the Bible. But while the claim that he turned Jesus into a god or created the Christian Bible at the Council of Nicaea are both myths, that ecumenical council actually did discuss and rule on the date of Easter. The council ruled that the date of Easter should not follow the Jewish calendar and should always fall after the spring equinox. It didn't say explicitly that it should be on a Sunday, however, nor did it detail exactly how its date should be calculated. so some confusion and inconsistency continued. By the 7th century, there were at least 3 competing methods of computus, the calculation of the date of Easter. There was the 84-year Liturgis cycle invented by Sulpicius Severus in the early 5th century. Then there was the method of Victorius of Aquitaine a little later. And finally, the one created by Dionysius Exiguus in the 6th century. Different communities in different parts of the Christian world use different computus calculations, which cause confusion and conflicts when practices intersected. In Britain, for example, most of the northern churches were heavily influenced by the Irish Church, which used the Severan method, but the southern churches tended to use the Victorian calculation favoured by Rome. This meant things got confusing at the court of the Kingdom of Northumbria, where King Oswiu followed the Irish practice while his queen Eanfled followed the Roman calculation. This meant one was celebrating the Easter feast, while the other one was still maintaining the fasting required during Lent, which was all a bit inconvenient. Clearly, some consistent practice needed to be established. So in 664, King Oswiu called a synod at the monastery of Whitby, presided over by his relative, the esteemed abbess called Hild. After a long debate, the story goes that when Wilfrid, the abbot of Ripon, noted the Victorian method was used in Rome and so had the authority of St. Peter, King Oswiu asked who was the gatekeeper of heaven. And when he was told it was St. Peter, he decreed that the Roman calculation would be used from then on. Apparently he was quite keen on getting into heaven and not offending St. Peter. Whether the decision went quite the way that story says or not, the date of Easter became standardised, and its calculation was detailed in a highly influential work by the Northern English scholar Bede. His De Temporum Ratione, or On the Reckoning of Time, was written sometime before 725 AD and became the standard text on the calculation of Easter across the Western Christian world. Bede detailed how to calculate the feast, summarising that the Sunday following the full moon, which falls on or after the spring equinox, will give a lawful Easter. This is why in the Western churches to this day, Easter always falls on a Sunday between March 22nd and April 25th. The key essentials here are that the time of year was determined by the gospel references to Jesus dying around the Passover, and the day of the week by the gospel references to him dying on a Sunday. It should be clear by now that there's something missing from everything I've just said. Any references to pagan goddesses, pagan festivals, or anything pagan at all. So what about the common pop history claims about a pagan origin for Easter, and the assertions made in the memes that so many online anti-theists like to share? Well, let's start with the claims about Easter and Ishtar. Ishtar was the Akkadian form of the name for the Sumerian goddess Inanna, and she was worshipped widely by the Assyrians and Babylonians under that name. But there's no evidence of any festival dedicated to her coinciding with Easter. Contrary to the popular meme's claims, her name was not pronounced Easter, and was actually pronounced more or less as it looks, Ishtar, or perhaps Ishtar. She was not primarily a goddess of fertility, though she was associated with sexuality, as well as kingship, date palms, and the planet Venus. And there was absolutely no evidence at all of her symbols, including the egg and the bunny. Her actual symbols were the lion, a 6 or 8 pointed star, and a bundle of reeds. Her cult centred mainly in the Middle East, but the Phoenician form of this goddess, called Ashtart, found its way into the Mediterranean world via Phoenician and Carthaginian traders and sailors, and was worshipped as far afield as Spain. In the Roman world, she was called Astarte, and this Western form of the cult survived for a while but was largely absorbed by similar Greco-Roman goddess cults. So the idea that there was some kind of flourishing festival of Ishtar in the 4th century for the Emperor Constantine to hijack as a Christian feast is simply fantasy. As I've already mentioned, the only connection between Constantine and the date of Easter is his calling the Council of Nicaea, which among many other things did rule to disconnect Easter from the Jewish calendar. But it didn't make any kind of ruling on exactly when Easter should fall, let alone steal some completely non-existent festival of a long since defunct Middle Eastern cult. So every single claim in the meme is total nonsense. So what about the other version of this claim, that the feast was originally that of the Germanic goddess Eostre? Again, it's regularly claimed that Christians stole the festival of the fertility goddess Eostre, whose symbols were the rabbit and the egg. Those online pop history articles have all kinds of details about this goddess and her festival, referring to legends of her giving birth to a rabbit or hare, decorated eggs being exchanged at her festival, and her feast day being a celebration of love, sex and fertility, even to the point of involving orgies. The only problem with all this is that everything we know about Eostre comes from one single brief passage in one medieval text, and it contains none of the details I just mentioned. This brief mention is found in a work I referred to earlier, Bede's early 8th century work De Temporum Ratione, on the reckoning of time. This is the work that popularised the standard computers for determining the date of Easter, but Bede's book was about the measurement of time generally and discusses units of time, calendars and historical chronology. It was considered such a useful work that it was widely copied throughout the Middle Ages, and as a result was substantially responsible for making the BC AD dating system widespread across Europe. In De Temporum, Bede details various calendar schemes and catalogues the traditional months of the Anglo-Saxon year, giving names and a brief description of each month. Some of his etymologies seem to refer to the agricultural cycles of the year, such as Weodmonath, or August, which means weed month, or Thrimilkemonath, or May, which means three milkings month. It was called that because in that month the cattle were milked 3 times a day thanks to the lush spring grass. Others refer to pagan practices. Bede says Halgemonath, September, is holy month because it was a month of sacred rites, possibly associated with the harvest. And he says 2 months were named after goddesses, Hrethmonath, March, after Hretha, and Eostremonath, April, after our goddess Eostre. And here is where we get the one and only reference to Eostre anywhere in an actual source. Bede says, Eostremonath has a name that is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honour feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honoured name of the old observance. And that's it. All he says about this goddess is that feasts were celebrated in this month in her honour. There's nothing about bunnies or eggs, nothing about her being a fertility goddess, nothing about love and sex, and absolutely no mention of orgies. All those details are modern fantasies. Given that Bede's mention of Eostre is the only one we have, some historians have even doubted there was ever such a goddess, and posited that Bede didn't actually have a clue what Eostremonath meant, and he simply invented an Eostre goddess to explain the obscure name. Old English language scholar Philip A. Shaw, however, disagrees, noting some place names and Anglo-Saxon personal names that he interprets as references to this goddess. In his book Pagan Goddesses in the Early Germanic World, Eostre, Hreda and the Cult of Matrons, Shaw notes 2 places called Eastleigh, one in Kent and one in Cambridgeshire, and one called Estrington in Yorkshire. He interprets the first 2 as referring to a district, or yea, of Eostre, and the latter to the enclosure, or tun, of the Eastrings, i.e. the people of Eostre. He also notes the Anglo-Saxon personal name Eostewin, literally Eostre friend, which happened to be the name of a 7th century abbot at Bede's own monastery of Jarrow. Then there's the Middle English name Estrild, which seems to derive from the Old English form Eosterhild. Exactly how widespread the worship of this goddess was is also unclear. She does seem to have been worshipped in pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon England, but the fact that April was called Ostermanod in the Old High German may indicate that she was worshipped in Western Germany as well. What is clear, however, is that the celebration of Easter and its date have nothing to do with Eostre. That's because both were established centuries before Christianity came into contact with the Anglo-Saxons. This means the only even slightly pagan thing about Easter is its English name. The goddess gave her name to the month, and then the month gave its English name to the already established Christian festival. This is the only connection with anything pagan. Apart from English and German, the name of Easter in pretty much every European language indicates its actual origin. All of its forms are derived from the Greek Pascha, which is the Greek form of the Hebrew Peash, meaning Passover. The English form is only derived indirectly from the largely forgotten goddess, because the feast usually fell in the month that carried her name. We have no idea exactly when the feasts of this goddess that Bede mentions had once been celebrated, and we can be pretty sure they didn't fall on the Sunday following the full moon, which falls on or after the spring equinox, like Easter. Easter is not an appropriation of this goddess's festival and has almost no connection to her at all. So what about the pagan remnants that are Easter eggs and the Easter bunny? As already noted above, there is no evidence linking Ishtar to eggs, rabbits or hares, despite the claims to that effect, and we have nothing connecting Eostre to eggs or bunnies. The single mention of her by Bede tells us almost nothing about her other than her name. Given that no eggs or rabbits appear in any of the Easter narratives in the Gospels, most people just assume they must have some kind of pagan origin. After all, the usual Christian explanation that eggs symbolise the rebirth of Christ and his resurrection sounded dubious to me even as a kid. But it does seem that the tradition of decorating and eating eggs at Easter has a medieval Christian origin after all. Christianity has long instituted days of fasting in association with various festivals and celebrations in its liturgical calendar, and the earliest evidence we have of a 40-day fast before Easter comes from the festal letter of Athanasius from 330 AD. What a fast meant varied, but it usually involved abstaining from meat and often also required avoiding all animal food products, including cheese, butter and eggs. The 5th century historian Socrates Scholasticus noted at least some people abstained from eating eggs on fast days, and the Council of Trullo in 692 AD recommended that people do so. It seems good, therefore, that the whole Church of God, which is in all the world, should follow one rule and keep the fast perfectly. And as they abstain from everything which is killed, so also should they from eggs and cheese, which are the fruit and produce of those animals from which we abstain. By the Middle Ages, abstaining from eggs on fast days and in Lent had become the standard practice in Western Europe. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century made this requirement very clear. Eggs and milk foods are forbidden to those who fast, for as much as they originate from animals, they provide us with flesh. Again, the Lenten fast is the most solemn of all, both because it is kept in imitation of Christ and because it disposes us to celebrate devoutly the mysteries of our redemption. For this reason, the eating of flesh, meat, is forbidden in every fast, while the Lenten fast lays a general prohibition even on eggs and milk. So this prohibition gave rise to 2 European customs maintained to this day: eating pancakes and pastries on Shrove Tuesday before the Lent fast began, and eating eggs on Easter Sunday when it ended. Using up what eggs, milk and butter people had before the fast made sense, rather than letting this perishable food go to waste. And since hens would have been paying no attention to any Christian fasts and still laying through Lent, there would have been plenty of eggs on hand to eat on Easter Sunday morning. In fact, eggs gathered in the week ahead of Easter could have been stored or hard-boiled in preparation for Easter Sunday, when they would have been quite a treat to peasants who had just endured over a month on a diet of bread, vegetables and some fish. We have the first references to these eggs being decorated in the 13th century, but that practice may have started in the Middle East much earlier. What we don't have is any reference to any pagan spring festival or customs involving eggs. The most logical source of Easter eggs, therefore, is the Christian practice of a Lenten fast in which this readily available staple could not be eaten. So what about the Easter bunny? Surely that must be a pagan symbol of fertility and so ancient in origin as well. Well, again, no. Easter became associated with a number of animals in Northern European folk traditions, essentially animals who would migrate back to Europe in early spring or who became more active and visible as the weather begins to warm. So we have German folk traditions about the Osterfuchs, the Easter fox, and others about the Easter stork, the Easter cuckoo, the Easter ravens, and even Easter butterflies. But the modern Easter bunny derives from the northern German traditions about the Osterhase, the Easter hare. Hares are generally shy and solitary animals, but in early spring they become much more social as part of their mating behaviour. So around March, In most of Northern Europe, hares can be seen in the fields boxing, with males competing for mates and females occasionally rebuffing males physically. The sight of groups of hares in the fields would have been a sign of the onset of spring and that Easter was just around the corner for rural people without calendars. Thus the German and Dutch tradition of the Easter hare, which then came to the US. Since rabbits are cuter, more common and better known in America than hares, the Easter hare became the Easter bunny. This then spread to the rest of the world as a way of selling more chocolate. So again, no paganism. So Ishtar had nothing to do with Easter. Eostre had nothing to do with the Christian festival other than its name, and Easter eggs and the Easter bunny aren't pagan either. So where did all this crap come from? One of the interesting things about having spent several decades tracking down crank pseudo history is how often I find these dumb ideas can all be traced back to a single source. In this case, we have memes being shared uncritically both by New Agers and neo-pagans and by vehement new atheists, which is deeply ironic given that the source of these ideas is a 19th century fundamentalist Christian. Alexander Hislop was a minister in the Free Church of Scotland and a parish schoolmaster in Caithness. He was a vehement critic of anything to do with Catholicism and became convinced that while good Protestants like him followed the true faith of Jesus Christ, the Catholic Church was actually the ancient Babylonian mystery cult of Nimrod, an obscure pagan figure mentioned a few times in the Old Testament. According to Hislop, Satan allowed the Emperor Constantine, yes, him again, to hijack the true Christian faith and lead it into idol worship and papist error, and that it was only by recognising this and throwing off any pre-Reformation vestiges that people could return to true Christianity. Hislop initially published his thesis as a pamphlet in 1853, but then added a large amount of material to it and published it as The Two Babylons. The papal worship proved to be the worship of Nimrod and his wife, which he published in 1858. Hislop's book is a remarkable case study in the level of abject nonsense that can be created out of a stupid initial assumption, a burning desire to find or create evidence to support it, and the motivating energy of good old-fashioned prejudice and bigotry. So Hislop takes sources that have since been shown to be wrong and new information from digs in the Middle East that he simply didn't understand to create a complete fantasy of stunning complexity and total idiocy. So, for example, we're told that the mitres worn by Catholic bishops take their shape from the fish head hats worn by the ancient priests of the pagan god Dagon, though this ignores the fact that Catholic mitres didn't take their current form until at least the 10th century AD, and earlier forms didn't look anything like the bizarre hats in Hislop's rather dubious illustrations of these pagan priests. And where Hislop was unable to come up with actual evidence, he simply makes strings of assertions, like Nimrod was born on December 25th, or Christmas tree balls are Babylonian sun symbols, none of which have the slightest substantiation. But Hislop's book became a bestseller and remains very popular among the loonier elements of fundamentalist Protestantism. The Jehovah's Witnesses still cite Hislop as an august authority in regular articles repeating his claims. The infamous tract publisher Jack T. Chick was a huge fan of Hislop, and several of his crazier evangelical comic books were simply rehashes of Hislop's thesis, such as his 1987 comic Why Is Mary Crying? And white supremacist groups of the Christian identity variety also regularly feature Hislop's claims in their material. So Hislop seems to be the ultimate point of origin for the claims that Ishtar and Eostre were the original source of Easter, thanks to the wickedness of Catholics and, of course, Satan. He devotes a whole section to the pagan origins of Easter in his chapter on the wicked satanic festivals of the Catholic Church. What means the term Easter itself? It is not a Christian name. It bears its Chaldean origin on his very forehead. Easter is nothing else than Astarte, one of the titles of Beltis, the Queen of Heaven, whose name, as found by Layard on the Assyrian monuments, is Ishtar. He goes on to detail a fervid fantasy about Middle Eastern gods being taken to Britain by, of course, the Druids, who he claims worshipped the Babylonian god Baal. Then he makes the following series of acrobatic leaps. If Baal was thus worshipped in Britain, it would not be difficult to believe that his consort Astarte was also worshipped by our ancestors, whose name in Nineveh was Ishtar. The religious solemnities of April, as now practiced, are called by the name of Easter, that month among our pagan ancestors having been called Easter Monath. He then traces his pagan Easter and its Catholic customs via a circuitous route through the 40-day fast of the Yazidis, the pagan devil worshippers of Kurdistan, and somehow the pagan Mexicans, and the cults of Adonis, Osiris, Ceres, and Tammuz, before it was imposed on the poor Christians of Britain by the wicked and satanic Church of Rome. He concludes, "Such is the history of Easter. The popular observances that still attend the period of its celebration amply confirm the testimony of history as to its Babylonian character. The hot cross buns of Good Friday and the dyed eggs of Pasch or Easter Sunday featured in the Chaldean rites just as they do now." So pretty much all the elements of the memes discussed earlier can be found here, though not the satanic hot cross buns, which Hislop condemns as celebrating the goddess Easter and therefore also evil. I imagine Mr. Hislop is not very fun at parties. Hislop's junk scholarship was very popular, and while his whole thesis generally only appealed to his hardline Protestant audience, his claims permeated 19th century and early 20th century pop culture. So we can find them popping up in esoterica, in tracts by theosophists and occultists, and in free thinker pamphlets, which recycled anti-Catholic material with uncritical enthusiasm. And now we find supposedly rational online atheists cluelessly regurgitating this hoary fundamentalist 19th century Christian nonsense because they don't check their facts and just accept any garbage that appeals to them purely on faith, which is highly ironic. Happy Easter, and see you again here soon.